There are situations where you can have, as I said before, we'd love to know what the impact of prison sentences is on people's outcomes, but we can't randomly assign people to go to prison or not. But we do all the time randomize cases to different judges. That means that you effectively have randomization to different outcomes for at least a set of cases where you would disagree. And so that is that's the kind of scenario in the real world that can give someone like me traction on being able to distinguish, well, what is the effect of prison? If someone gets lucky and gets a more lenient judge, and as a result is less likely to go to prison, and someone else gets unlucky and gets a harsh judge, and as a result is more likely to go in prison, we can then follow those two people over time, see what happens to them, and be more confident that really the only difference between those two people is that luck of the draw, that they got the lenient or harsh judge. There wasn't something different about their cases that we just couldn't see in the data.
Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Ken Broad. My wife and I, Jackie, we're longtime supporters of the Commonwealth Club. In fact, I was here last night for an event. Absolutely love this venue, the authors, 400 events a year. So if you're not a member, please do sign up. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jennifer Doleac. She's a leading expert on economics of crime and discrimination, and a vocal proponent of using rigorous research to inform policy. She's currently Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, which is an amazing organization. John and Laura Arnold have just dedicated their lives to improving public policy, using philanthropy focused on evidence-based policy. So she works for a wonderful organization. Before that, Jen spent over a decade as an economics professor conducting economic research. So she's really an academic at heart. Her new book, The Science of Second Chances, A Revolution in Criminal Justice, is an optimistic approach to criminal justice reform using research to break the cycle of reoffense and incarceration. So it's really, again, looking not left versus right or making things based on emotion. It's really focused on evidence base. Moderating tonight's program, I'm just blown away by her level of due diligence on this book, is LaDoris Cordell. She's a retired California Superior Court judge and author of Her Honor, My Life on the Bench, What Works, What's Broken, and How to Change It. Judge Cordell spent 20 years on the bench, primarily presiding over criminal cases. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Doleac and Judge Cordell.
Thank you all for being here, and welcome to, and you've asked me to call you Jen?
Yes,
okay,
please.
Great. All right, so I'm going to start our conversation with a disclaimer. I am not a social scientist. I am not an economist. I have no background and no expertise in these fields. So why am I interviewing a social scientist and an economist? Because the club asked me to. And also because I'm always interested in talking to people who have opinions about our criminal legal system. That being said, if there are any of you here in the audience who do have an expertise in economics and/or in social science, I hope that you will weigh in with your questions just by writing on the cards that are there by your seats. But this does not mean that I don't have questions for you, Jen. I have plenty of them. So let's get started. Mm-hmm. So how did you come to focus your work, or at least this book, on the criminal legal system? I got involved as a result of growing up primarily in a Black community and bearing witness to how the criminal legal system can wreak havoc on the lives of poor people, Black people, brown people. My parents were community activists who instilled in me a drive to address some of the ills in the criminal legal system. And the great majority of the cases over which I presided, as Ken mentioned, were in juvenile criminal cases and adult cases. So what is your motivation?
Yeah, I loved economics. I went to graduate school because I was 22, living in DC, loved public policy, loved the idea that policy can make people's lives better, can improve the situations of people on the ground, and has such an impact on people every day. And I looked around, and everyone who had a job that seemed really cool to me had a PhD in economics. And so I was like, okay, I think that's the route I need to go. And the toolkit that economics provides, the idea that people respond to incentives, that there are always trade-offs, but economists also think a lot about distinguishing cause from effect, distinguishing correlation from causation. Like, how can we find either run randomized trials or use natural experiments, which I'm sure we'll talk more about, to be able to figure out what actually works to reach our goals. That all seemed really cool and interesting to me. And so I went to get a PhD, and at the time had no real interest in the criminal justice system beyond, a general layperson's interest. Figured I'd study education or something else. And a lot of graduate school programming for PhD students in econ really is hunting around for interesting natural experiments. So I read a newspaper article about law enforcement DNA databases. And the point of the article was that you have all this variation across states in the United States about which categories of offenders are required to provide DNA to their state DNA database. And so that sets up a system where you have people convicted of the exact same offense in different states, and one goes in the database and the other person doesn't. And the point of the article was, isn't this really arbitrary and ridiculous that the laws are so different across places? And that might be true, but it's really great for research. And so I read that article as a researcher and thought, jackpot, right? Like, this is a great natural experiment to figure out what's the impact of these DNA databases on criminal behavior. And so that became my dissertation. And the further down that road I went, it was just really clear that there are so many interesting and important problems in this space where the economic toolkit can shed some really useful light. And so here I am many years later.
So I do want you to know, I call it the criminal legal system. I don't call it a criminal justice system because I think there's so many things that are broken, but it's a work in progress. So when we get to where we should be, then I'll call it a criminal justice system. That's just me. All right. Okay, so based on that thesis you wrote, then it's like, okay, I want to learn more and more about what's going on in this criminal legal system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
You describe yourself as a social scientist who, and I'm quoting from your book, focuses on designing studies that measure impacts using actual data. You also describe your work as, and I'm quoting, helping communities test their ideas as if we're scientists in a lab. And finally, you wrote, I want to offer a different perspective based on economics instead of personal values. So what exactly is your scientific economic approach, and how do you define personal values? So it's a compound question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, let me take the first part first. So what is the addition that what does the economics lens bring to this? One part is the sort of the set of theories that economists have about the world. And so, every set of social scientists, sociologists, political scientists, economists have a different theoretical lens that they view problems through. Economist lens is that everyone is, choosing or making choices every day in a way that will maximize their own happiness. Right? Like, we're all doing the best we can given the constraints that we have and the options available to us. And we all respond to incentives. We all respond to, costs and benefits of different available options. And so if you want to change someone's behavior, you should change the costs and benefits that people that are associated with some choice. So that's the theoretical lens. And it turns out there are just a lot of misaligned incentives throughout the criminal justice system. And so having that lens through which to look at the system, I think can reveal new hypotheses about how to solve the problems we see. The second piece of what the economic toolkit brings is this real obsession with distinguishing correlation from causation. And, other social scientists use this toolkit too, but we basically can't publish anything that doesn't use this. And so economists really developed this toolkit to be able to I think a lot of us are familiar with, the FDA, if you need to do randomized trials to test new drugs, right, in the medical field. And so the ideal scenario, if we want to test whether a program works or policy works, is you run a randomized trial. That's not possible in a lot of the real world scenarios. We can't actually randomize who goes to prison, for instance. But we'd like to know what the impact of prison is. And so economists have developed a toolkit that enables us to find real world scenarios that sort people as if at random into these treatment and control groups, again, as if they were that, the treatment and control group in that ideal lab experiment. And so that toolkit is really powerful and enables us to measure the real world impact of policies and programs that we'd like to know, whether they work and how much they work. So that's a big piece economists are bringing to the table. And then the third piece is, partly because we're so good at measuring those costs and benefits of different things, or the real world impact of these different policies and programs, we can do really detailed cost-benefit analyses that inform policymakers who are trying to allocate scarce resources, right? The reality is we can't do everything we'd like to do. There's limited time, limited bandwidth, limited money. We have to make trade-offs. We have to decide, we're going to spend the marginal dollar on this instead of this. How do we make those choices when everything sounds great? And so being able to think through and looking at the data and evidence based on those experiments that we've run, see, okay, well, the ROI, the return on investment, is bigger over here than over here. That can help guide policy choices. So that's the economics lens that I'm trying to bring to these questions. Now, the personal values question. Yes. I think a lot of conversations in the criminal justice space tend to be around, what rights should people have? What should our goals be? And that tends to be, that's really based on differences in preferences, differences in personal values. I have nothing special to say about that. I have my own preferences. I have my own personal values. They're no more special or they're no more special or valuable than yours are or anyone else's in this room. That's not the special thing I'm bringing to this conversation. And we need those people. We need people. In many ways, this is what lawyers are trained to do, right? Think about constitutional freedoms and constitutional rights and what do people deserve. And that's a really important part of this conversation. But we also need to know what works, what's the impact of our policies and programs. And, if our goal is to, implement a reentry program to help people find jobs, does it actually do that? How much does it actually move the needle? And is it better or worse than some alternative program we could have implemented? And so there are empirical questions that we need answers to. And those are the types of questions that the skill set I have is valuable for answering, where lawyers have less to say.
Interesting. So the basis for all of your studies is your utilization of what you call, and not just you, this is in the field, natural experiments.
Yeah.
Right? So what are natural experiments?
Yeah. So they are these real world scenarios that divide people or places up into treatment and comparison groups as if at random. So we're really, and there are a few, I'd say, standard research designs that people use that I can talk through. But basically, this is, to me, the fun part of the job as a researcher, as an economist, is finding these natural experiments. It's almost like a scavenger hunt, like looking, reading through or talking to people in the real world and saying, well, how exactly do you choose who's coming into your program? Do you have a wait list, right? Are you, when you're interviewing someone, what are you looking for? When you're sitting on the bench and deciding a case, which exactly, what determines which cases you hear, and how do you decide which outcomes that person's going to get? We're always looking for specific factors that can trigger ideas about, is there some variation there that seems like there's some randomness in the process that we can take advantage of. So for instance, there are situations where you can have, as I said before, we'd love to know what the impact of prison sentences is on people's outcomes, but we can't randomly assign people to go to prison or not. But we do all the time randomize cases to different judges. And different judges have different preferences and professional judgment.
Really?
You would know better than I do. Presumably you and your colleagues might have disagreed sometimes about, or, if you have very similar cases, might have made different decisions in those cases. And that means that you effectively have randomization to different outcomes for at least the set of cases where you would disagree. And so that is that's the kind of scenario in the real world that can give someone like me traction on being able to distinguish, well, what is the effect of prison? If someone gets lucky and gets a more lenient judge, and as a result is less likely to go to prison, and someone else gets unlucky and gets a harsh judge, and as a result is more likely to go in prison, we can then follow those two people over time, see what happens to them, and be more confident that really the only difference between those two people is that luck of the draw, that they got the lenient or harsh judge. There wasn't something different about their cases that we just couldn't see in the data that could explain their different outcomes.
Okay, so, but the personal values of the judges
Yep.
come into play
Absolutely.
into how we decide cases, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. So you used a phrase, and you use it in your book, where you describe natural experiments, and I'm quoting from you, with identical people charged with the same crime.
Yeah.
So here's my question, again, is not as an economist.
Yeah.
People aren't identical.
Yeah.
People are inherently different. Even identical twins are different. So people have different upbringings, right? Different values, different life experiences, different motivations. And just because you just mentioned this, crimes have the same label, it doesn't mean that the crimes are the same.
Yep.
Right? So a trespass into a synagogue is different from a trespass into an abandoned construction site, for example. So what, and the motivations, like shoplifting for food because you're hungry,
Yeah.
versus shoplifting, same label, same crime,
Yeah.
at Macy's because you just feel like taking the sweater.
Yeah.
All right. So talk to me about that. Why?
Yeah.
What's this identical?
So this is exactly why these natural experiments are so important, because when you look in the data, a different way to do this is to just go into the data and say, okay, we're going to compare people who look identical based on everything we can see. They're charged with shoplifting, they're the same age, they're the same race, they live in the same neighborhood, and this person got 2 years in prison, and this person, their case was dismissed. And we'll just say, those people are, that's just luck of the draw, that's the natural experiment, we'll compare them over time. But as you said, there are probably some other differences between those people and those cases that the judge saw that maybe I, as the researcher, can't see in the data. The person whose case was dropped was hungry, and that's why they stole the food, or they seemed really remorseful. And so this is why finding these experiments in the real world to sort cases in a way that is as if we had a coin that we flipped, it gives us more confidence that there isn't something that we can't see about the cases. But then the other answer to your question really is this is why, we're looking at the kinds of studies that I and other economists are doing are looking at lots of data. We're not looking at an individual case and saying this one person wound up in prison because, they got lucky or they got the lenient judge. It's, we can't tell in that one individual case. But when you have a large number of cases and aggregate them, on average, we can say across the two groups, we're going to say that these two groups of people, there's no reason to think that they're any different in any way on average across the group.
So we're talking larger numbers.
Larger numbers, right.
So when you use identical, what you're saying is they're in a particular category? Something like that.
Yeah. I think in identical in ways that, the key piece is we want to follow people over time and see what happens to them. So if what we're interested in is what's the impact of this treatment, going to prison, this reentry program, going to school, whatever it is, what's the impact on their likelihood of reoffending, then what we really want to know is, would the people that we've sorted into these treatment and control groups, would they have the same outcomes? Would their risk of reoffending be equivalent if not for the treatment, if the fact that this treatment group wasn't in this program? So really the identical piece really means, are they on the same trajectory for that outcome measure that we really care about?
So you are, I'm calling you this, and I think you are a leader in this fairly new movement of economists. And I think it really has kind of taken off since maybe 2010. All right? And this group, this movement of economists are weighing in on public policy in a variety of areas. This movement has generated, especially I think in the criminal legal system, a lot of controversy. And it's pretty heated controversy. And you write about this in the first chapter of the book and somewhat throughout. What is it that you and your fellow economists are doing that, in your words, this is from the book, is ruffling many feathers, and whose feathers in particular?
I think there are, well, some of the controversy comes from an interest in really just in testing what is working in the real world without a preconceived notion or an ideological prior that we want evidence that's going to, support one side or the other. So part of it is, not being interested in whether, the blue team liked this policy, so we're going to find evidence that this policy worked because we're on the blue team versus the red team. So part of it is just like using the scientific method to say whether something's effective or not. Some of it is that we economists have developed this toolkit that I'm describing. We're really, again, obsessed with finding these natural experiments to distinguish correlation from causation. And that is in the grand scheme of research, a relatively new toolkit that other fields are not using, that there are a lot of researchers in this space that are not using. And I think those researchers have become very comfortable, and those things have been going very well for them, and people hear them and listen to their opinions and their conclusions about research and what works. And I think, frankly, a lot of times they're getting it wrong, and that's not helping people on the ground, right? Policies that don't work don't help people, and so it's really important to me that we use the most rigorous methods we can to test what's working. I think we owe it to the communities that where there's violence, where there are people who are in the system, and we are all better off if they leave the system better than they came in. And right now, I think we're in a situation right now where, I'm not sure there's anyone who thinks our criminal justice system is working great, right? Clearly, the status quo is not acceptable. We all have different ideas about what could be more effective. And there are lots of people who are happy to just have those arguments on Twitter. And I'd rather go look at the data and go test things in the real world and see what works. But doing it in a way where we're using these really rigorous methods that we can have a lot of confidence in. And a lot of the research that's out there does not meet the bar that I and my fellow economists have set. And so yeah, I think the ruffling of feathers is sometimes, me or one of my colleagues writing a paper saying this really popular policy does not work. And maybe it actually is making things worse, and bringing that bad news to the policy conversation. And sometimes it's, we're the ones who are saying that research that you are promoting right now actually isn't that good. And we can't make the conclusion that you're drawing from it. And so yeah, I think part of it is just being willing to stand up and say the unpopular thing.
So when you talk about the red team or blue team, when you go in, are you on any team?
I actually love it when people can't tell what my politics are. I try very hard. I don't view it as my role to say what someone's goals should be. I view it as my training as an economist is to ask you what your goals are, What is the outcome you're trying to change? What are the constraints you're operating within? And then my job, what I am really good at, is helping you optimize all the inputs to maximize whatever that goal is you're trying to reach. And I have nothing to say about what that goal should be, whether it's reducing racial disparities or reducing incarceration or reducing crime. That's up to you. I lead the criminal justice program at Arnold Ventures, which is a philanthropy focused on evidence-based policy. And I tell my team all the time, like, our job is to be the stewards of the evidence. We're the lobby out there. We invest a lot in more and better research, but then we have a policy and advocacy team that goes out and works with mostly state lawmakers. That's where most criminal justice policy happens. And we're the lobby out there arguing for evidence-based policy. And sometimes the policies we're pushing will align with what the left, favors, and sometimes the policies we're pushing align with what the right favors. I think we're actually lucky in this moment that a lot of the evidence-based policies that exist, the types of policies that academics who work in this space know about, you don't see those mentioned on cable news much, so they're not really tied to any team, and so that's a lot of great opportunity.
Well, let's talk about some specific things.
Yeah.
So the first subject in your book I found very interesting. You started talking about it a little bit a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
The first study is where you weighed in on DNA databases. Mm-hmm. And as you noted in your book, 31 states collect DNA samples from, I'm not sure if it's everyone convicted of felonies, I'm not sure if it's arrested.
Every state at this point collects DNA from people convicted of felonies, so it's the arrest where there's, differences.
So you took a look at the use of these DNA databases, mm-hmm. and the reason we have them, I mean, the thing that popped up in my mind right away was, sure, so that if somebody reoffends, mm-hmm. we see if their DNA is in the database and we catch them.
Yeah.
All right?
Right.
So you took a look at the use of these and recommended expanding DNA databases. So how did you come to this conclusion?
Yeah.
Tell us everything.
This is one of those cool natural experiments. So the way that DNA databases are expanded, so they're governed at the state level in the U.S., and a lot of countries around the world have these now too. So if California wanted to expand its DNA database, they would pass a law saying this new category of people probably arrested or charged with certain crimes are required to add a DNA sample as of this date. And that sets up a scenario where anyone charged with that crime that date or later goes in the database, and anyone charged with the exact same crime the day before or earlier does not. And so you can see these people who are charged with, again, that exact same crime, even one day apart. There's nothing else different about them, again, on average, across the groups. Everything about their experience of the criminal justice system is the same. Their sentences are going to be the same, all of that. But one person's in the database, so now the likelihood that they will get caught if they reoffend is much higher. And one person does not go in the database. And we can compare those two people over time, or the groups of people who are charged on either side of that.
And let me interrupt, so race doesn't come into play in this?
Race doesn't come into play, right. So on average across this threshold, this effective date, you should have, the same percentage of people are white, same percentage of people are black. There's no reason that, like the thing that the economists would want to check is, well, maybe the criminals knew, maybe people who are committing crimes or maybe the prosecutors knew when they were charging, and they made sure that they waited to charge people after the database goes into effect. And so, but in practice that just doesn't happen. People aren't quite that strategic. So on average, the people who were charged on either side of this effective date are identical, again, in average terms. You can follow them over time and see what happens to their likelihood of reoffending. And I've done research now in the US and in Denmark, where we have much better data because Denmark has amazing administrative data. In the Denmark case, which is closer to the policy frontier in the US, they added anyone charged with the equivalent of a felony. Charged, not convicted. And so using that natural experiment, found that people who are just barely in the database because of that effective date are 42% less likely to come back with new charges in the future. So that's a really big drop in future criminal justice involvement. And is in line with the U.S. Evidence. Again, it's noisier. There are a bunch of reasons it could be a smaller effect. Was smaller. It was on the order of like 15-20% drop. In the Danish case, it was actually especially interesting that we found the biggest effects for younger people. So people who were, in general, we were looking at 18 to 30-year-old men. That's the group that's most criminally active in most places. So that's the group that where you'd expect to see the biggest effect if you're trying to reduce crime. And then within that, we kind of split it as like the younger group and the older group within that relatively young group. People ages 18 to 24 were just dramatically, most of the effect was really driven by them. They were really dramatically less likely to reoffend going forward. We could also link, because it's Denmark, we could look at employment, education. What else are they doing? They're more likely to have jobs now. They're more likely to be in school. And so we can see like this change in the incentives, making it clear that you are now much more likely to get caught if you continue down this road that you're on, was the incentive that people needed to, or a wake-up call or something.
That was the deterrent.
That was the deterrent. It had that deterrent effect, and people changed course. Now, this is in line with, so, these are two studies. You might say, well, we'd want to see, a whole bunch more. This is in line with a whole bunch of other evidence we have that increasing the probability of getting caught has a much bigger deterrent effect than increasing the severity of sentences, or the length of sentences. And a big part of the reason here is that most people who are on the margin of committing crime just aren't thinking very far ahead. So, it's a reasonable idea that if we want to deter crime, again, I'm an economist, you change the cost of benefits, right? So one way to increase the cost of committing crime is make sentences longer. And that is still our sort of default policy choice in the US, is if we're worried about crime in a community, make sentences longer. The problem is that, again, people aren't thinking that far ahead. Prison's really expensive. So putting people in prison for a really long time, you're not getting the deterrent effect on the front end. You're not changing people's behavior today. Most people age out of crime really quickly, so you're just locking people up for a really long time, and there's not really a public safety benefit to that. But what does change behavior is consistent, reliable, swift, certain consequences for criminal behavior. And so you can get that through putting more police on the streets. You can get that through having cameras around. You can get that through DNA databases. And so I think it's really interesting. This is the type of policy that isn't assigned to red team or blue team, right? It's really interesting. We're finding that there's a lot of bipartisan interest, and it's like, we can try to reduce crime by shifting our focus from making sentences longer to solving more crimes faster. That helps communities. It has this big deterrent effect we see in the data, and it's also a lot cheaper.
Okay, so I'm not an economist, but I'm going to ask you this. You have a sentence in the book, early on it says, you wrote DNA databases seem pretty benign. And so I want to ask you this, but are they really?
Yeah.
There are cases of lab techs who make mistakes, who determine that the DNA match was there when it wasn't. There's a concern, I think, about creating a genetic kind of dragnet.
Sure.
Where you look at familial DNA, other people get pulled in who have nothing to do with the criminal behavior. And then I brought it up earlier, but racial disparities in incarceration means that there is a disproportionate collection of African American men in these DNA databases. And they're stored in federal and in state databases. And one last thing I want to bring up, I found this fairly recent, 2013 U.S. Supreme Court case, and it was Scalia wrote a scathing dissent, and strangely, he was joined by three liberal jurists, Sotomayor, Kagan, and at the time, Bader Ginsburg. And he warned in this case, and this is a quote from Scalia, with the three joining him in the dissent, He writes, your DNA can be taken and entered into a national DNA database if you are ever arrested, rightly or wrongly, and for whatever reason. And he was saying this is not a good thing to have all this. So do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. This is presumably Maryland v. King case.
It is Maryland v. King, yes.
So this is the big case that the other justices decided that it was okay, it was constitutional to take DNA at arrest.
And it was a rape case, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I think that sounds right, yeah.
They found a second case based upon the DNA.
Yeah, so you can use the DNA database to either link cases or link offenders to the cases, right? And so the reason that the other justices decided the way they did is they viewed DNA as a means of identification, not a part of the punishment, essentially. And so we take fingerprints from everybody now. We don't expunge the fingerprints after if their case is dismissed or after they finish their sentence. That is in a national database that can be compared to crime scene evidence. And so if you think of, and I do think of DNA as being just a better fingerprint, a more accurate fingerprint, a fingerprint that's more useful because it is more difficult to avoid leaving DNA at a crime scene than it is to avoid leaving fingerprints at a crime scene, then as a means of identification, we should be treating this the way fingerprints are. Now, I think, this is, in this context, when you think about costs and benefits to policies, there are huge public benefits to DNA databases. The financial cost of DNA databases is pretty small. So purely financial terms, this is a clear win. But as you're highlighting here, like the cost that we should be considering for this tool, and frankly, a whole lot of tools that can increase the probability of getting caught, is the potential privacy cost, right? And so cameras, AI is going to open up a whole lot of new tools that are available to us. So we need to have a way to think through, okay, what are the privacy costs in this case? And are there any ways to mitigate that privacy cost? Alongside, can we measure what the benefits are? And then we can have an informed conversation. So in this case, with DNA databases, I think, people are used to thinking of, you can take your own saliva swab, send it to 23andMe, and you can see all this interesting information about yourself and family connections and all of that. That's not what law enforcement DNA databases are doing. So they are looking at specific sections of your DNA, then specifically looking at non-coding sections, and and this is where I am not a geneticist, and it's going to become really clear really quickly. But basically, they're like repeating sections of your DNA on those non-coding pieces. And so what the DNA database is doing and basically coming up with a unique identifier for you is it just counts the number of repeats there. And that's not interesting information for anything except that varies a lot person to person. So if you look at enough of those different places, count up the number of repeats across all these different sections, you come up with a string of numbers. That string of numbers, I think it's very similar in some ways to a Social Security number, where the individual numbers don't mean anything, but together they uniquely identify you. And so that string of numbers is what's uploaded to the database. And that is and it's only useful for matching to other DNA. There are people who work in this space who print that string of numbers on their business card and they hand it out to people just as evidence, like, you can't do anything with this, right? This isn't actually, there's no way you can use this information to tell anything useful about.
So somebody hacked in. You're
doesn't
saying
matter.
It's not
There's nothing in there. You can't decipher that in some way to say what your health is like or anything about that. It's really just the string of numbers that enables you to match to DNA from crime scenes. Now that is different from, in many states, they have been, and now they're not anymore because there's new technology, and I'll get to that in a moment, but looking at partial matches of DNA that could link to a family member. And so that has been used in states, and states have passed laws about regulating this use because it can seem, that can feel more invasive, right? And that is it's just another layer to the privacy cost. But you can use it in really extreme cases. So if you have a particularly terrible murder or serial rapist or something like that, you want to have that option, and maybe you're willing to accept a bit more invasion of privacy in order to catch this person. Now, there are big advances now in DNA, and there are private labs out there using what's called forensic genetic genealogy, where they are analyzing more of your genome to be able to kind of build out the family tree and make connections outside of law enforcement DNA databases. Law enforcement also is using this, again, in specific cases where, these are violent crimes. It's important to the community to solve them, and so maybe we're willing then to accept a bit more invasion of privacy there. I think this is the conversation we're going to need to have going forward and get comfortable having. And I think it's just really important to recognize there are huge public safety benefits on the table here. And it's completely understandable if some communities see that and, hear about some of these new tools or facial recognition or drones as first responders or any of these other new things that we can do now and say, nope, not worth it. Like, that's a perfectly acceptable conclusion for a community to reach. I just want to have the informed conversation and want everyone to know kind of what we're leaving on the table.
Well, I have received so many questions. I have to put these in, but I want to go to one topic before I get to questions, and that's leniency.
Yeah.
All right. You have a chapter called Err Toward Leniency. And it's a word that you do not hear prosecutors, at least many of them, utter. And it's a word that people who consider themselves tough on crime, you're not going to hear them talking about leniency. So when you look at how the criminal legal system deals with people prosecuted for, this is what you did, you looked at people prosecuted for nonviolent, low-level crimes. So first of all, tell us what are nonviolent, low-level crimes and what you looked at and where you come out with leniency.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a place where the data really changed my mind about the policy and the impact of the policy. So I was working with two amazing research colleagues looking at the impacts of deciding to either arraign or not arraign, so move the case forward or not, in that very first hearing that somebody has after they're arrested for a nonviolent misdemeanor. So these are things like shoplifting, trespassing, drug possession, like the low-level stuff where there typically isn't misdemeanors, right? And we were interested in this question of is it, once someone's arrested and is in court, basically what should we do, right? Should we throw the book at them? There's a camp that would say, if this is, in some ways, this is it's one version of broken windows, right? We should not only increase the likelihood that you're caught for this low-level stuff, but we should make sure there are really severe consequences for those offenses. And if you don't do that, then that's just going to embolden people if there are no consequences for shoplifting or drug possession. And then the other side is a position that's been popularized by more progressive prosecutors over the last decade, saying, for a lot of people, you're just kind of criminalizing poverty, and giving people a criminal record for these offenses just pulls them further into the system, and you're doing more harm than good. And okay, those are very different views and hypotheses about what could happen, and if we decide to move a case forward.
So I'm going to jump in because this subject could not be more timely here in San Francisco.
Okay.
You wrote in your book, in 2023, police in San Francisco began cracking down on public drug use, arresting more than 1,700 people between May and December. So that was during the current San Francisco DA's tenure. She's still the DA, all right? So here, the DA actions, she's now prosecuting, filing charges, prosecuting low-level offenses, and it's caused a crisis in the public defender's office. So most recently, a judge has held the public defender in contempt of court for refusing to represent people coming in because they say we just don't have enough people to represent them. So this could not be more timely than right now. So sorry to interrupt, but continue now. So
so I want to come back to this because this is, now that we're having policy conversations based on the research, this question of how do we actually just help our courts function is a driving factor here. So basically the way that we approach this as researchers, again, hunting for natural experiments, it turns out that the way, this is the huge bulk of cases that go through many courts. There's just a ton of these cases every day. And so you need to keep them moving. It's kind of the grunt work of the court system, these low-level offenses. And so you have this arraignment courtroom where they're all heard, and just whichever prosecutor is assigned to that arraignment room that day, like that's the prosecutor who's making the decision in the 2 to 3 minutes they have to decide, are we moving this case forward, or are we going to drop it? And so that means you essentially have, it's as if random assignment to different prosecutors, the individual cases. So some defendants are going to get lucky, and their case is going to be in that courtroom on a day with a more lenient prosecutor who is more inclined to just drop the case. And some defendants are going to get unlucky, and they're going to get a more harsh prosecutor who is determined to make sure that there are consequences here. And we can then follow people over time and see, okay, if you're one of the cases that got dismissed because you got lucky versus you're a case that moved forward because you got unlucky and got the more harsh prosecutor, what happens to you over time? We found that those where the case, just because of the luck of the draw, they had their case dismissed in that first hearing instead of potentially later, were 50% less likely to come back with new charges in the future. Huge effect. And this is, again, I said, this changed my mind about this space. I think I went into this study thinking, surely there are going to be trade-offs here, right? There's probably going to be some increase in crime. The question in my mind was just like, how big is that increase, and is it worth it, right? I mean, it's costly to the court to have to deal with all of these cases, and there's some cost of whatever the punishment is. Is it worth it for whatever the increase in crime was? There was no increase in crime. It was a drop in crime, and it took less effort from the prosecutor, and so everyone's better off. This is a free lunch that economists say doesn't exist, right? And so this is a place where it turns out that, again, for these nonviolent misdemeanor cases, the more progressive side, the progressive prosecutor, line was they were right. Their hypothesis was right in this situation. And we're skeptical by nature, so we were, of course, like, well, maybe these people just realized they got lucky, right? What if then the next step is, well, what's a policy based on this? If we actually have a policy change where we say you're much less likely to be prosecuted, now maybe that emboldens the entire community and you see crime go up. Well, we were doing this in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, where Boston's located. There was a DA there who had instituted a presumption of non-prosecution for a set of nonviolent misdemeanors. So there was a policy change we could look at. This wasn't a blanket, we're not prosecuting shoplifting, right? That I would strongly suspect would increase shoplifting if everybody knows that it's not going to be prosecuted. But it just shifted the default. It shifted the default a bit from, dismissing 20% of the cases to dismissing 50% of the cases. And we found that in general, there's no increase in crime. If anything, some of the crime categories definitely fell. We saw the same impacts on reoffending for the individuals going through the system. So that policy change did seem effective. That's, I think this is, and again, it gets tricky because I think the question then every prosecutor's office asks us is, well, which cases should we be dismissing? What's the line? And I think this is where you still do want to be using your professional judgment, but it really is just shifting the default from always prosecute to, or tend to prosecute to dropping the case. And even those tough on crime prosecutors who would say they're not lenient, they're dropping some cases too, right? I mean, you cannot move every case forward. It's just a matter of what share.
The system would explode.
The system would explode. So it's just a matter of degree here. Yeah.
So what about just not prosecuting these crimes at all?
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, right. So we put the study out, and a bunch of people immediately said, see, we should decriminalize all of these low-level offenses. Yeah. And that is not what these studies are showing. Like my study, and there's other interesting research on nonviolent felonies from Harris County, Texas, where Houston is, which is where I live now. And so still in line with this err toward leniency outcome. And yeah, so I mean, I think the punchline here is there were consequences here. This person was arrested. They had to come to court. They had to take a day off of work, likely. They were worried. This is the other key piece here is the The group that saw the biggest benefits by far were people for whom this was their first offense. So their first misdemeanor. In the felony studies, is their first felony case. And so helping people avoid that first charge on their record seems to be what really had the big benefits. And so especially if it's your first time in court, you're probably terrified, right? You're probably super nervous. For a lot of people, this is your rock bottom moment. I think the punchline for me is that is consequence enough. And for a very large share of these people, they will course correct on their own if we then get out of their way. And then if they come back, then we'll have to do something else, right? I get questions a lot too. I talk about this evidence and people will say, but what about the person who cycled through 17 times? And it's like, I'm not talking about them. Clearly we need to do something different for them. But for first timers, the evidence is pointing very strongly in the direction of that conviction, or that even that charge in most cases visible on your record, that's a real bludgeon we're using that has a real impact on your life. And makes it much more difficult to course correct if you want to course correct. And so we should be more sparing in when we put that record
I couldn't agree more with that. And once one is pulled into the criminal legal system, it is so difficult to get out.
Yeah.
So as you can see, I have a handful of questions here, so
Curious
I can't
audience.
possibly
Love
go
it.
through all of them. But let me just ask you the one from our audience. Empiricism has been used to excuse racial and gender bias among other human biases. How do you work to counter not only bias in your data, but in your data collection and decision methods? Eugenics, for example, was once broadly considered a data-driven science.
Oh gosh. This is fun. I have a good friend named Paige Harden who has a book out. She's a geneticist who is interested in crime. So those who are interested in the eugenics question in particular, I kind of wish she were here to answer that question. But I think, this is where I think it's important that someone understand the data they're working with, right? I mean, I think anyone who's worked with criminal justice data knows it's messy. Race categorization can be messy. I think, having any good researcher will spend lots of time on the ground talking to the practitioners who are, whose courtroom they're studying, or talking to the people who are, going through whatever program they're studying to try to understand what's going on. We'll talk about what their findings are and try to get feedback on that. Like, this should be a conversation with the communities that you're studying. I think any good researcher will do that. And I also think this is just where, any individual study can be wrong, but I do have a lot of faith in the scientific process and the scientific literature to work out those issues, right? And so if an individual researcher is biased and their methods aren't very good, and I have confidence in the overall system that there's a strong incentives built into the system into the scientific system to figure that out and write the study that overturns it. I think I'm honestly more concerned. I think there are a lot of really well-meaning policies out there that aim to reduce racial disparities that, again, are well-meaning but incredibly ineffective. And I think I worry much more about the disservice that does to communities than the risk that individual studies
Let's
might be
talk
biased.
about one, because it's in a question here, and it's actually a topic I was going to bring up with you.
Great.
So here's the question. What are the next steps to utilizing the findings of your research? I'm currently supporting, I guess that's the word, several ban-the-box related policies this current cycle. Are there any plans to put together a policy collaborative to include the advocacy community in digesting these findings?
Yeah.
Talk about ban the box, because
box.
that's a chapter in the book.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so this is one of those studies that ruffled feathers. So Ban the Box is a policy that aims to help people with criminal records get their foot in the door for employment. So,
There's a box, right?
there's
on
a
the
box, the
application.
kind of typical job application
What
for a
does it
long
ask?
time. Do you have a felony conviction?
Do you have a
typically.
felony conviction?
Sometimes it's just, do you have a criminal conviction? But usually it's, do you have a felony conviction? And there's a little box you check.
Yep.
And anecdotally, a lot of employers see that box checked and they just discard your application. And that is incredibly unfair to people who have served their time and would make great employees right now, and they cannot get their foot in the door to even get a job interview and be able to, build some rapport with their potential manager and maybe explain and tell them about their record, but about how much work they've done on themselves and how they've turned their lives around, all of that. And so Ban the Box is a policy that says, well, this is really unfair. We wish employers did not ask this question, did not care about this information up front. Let's tell them they can't ask anymore.
And that's a big movement in California.
Big movement. It's been a big movement across the country over
Right.
the last, for over a decade now, because the research on Ban the Box came out in 2016. So at that point, it had been around for quite a while. States and cities across the US, I think the UK has been considering it recently. Again, really well-meaning policy. It's sort of our natural impulse in lots of different settings, whether it's drug testing for employment or credit checks for employment. There are a lot of situations where we've put bans on
Right.
employers asking for information.
So because we're running, short on time.
Okay, I will
you
speed
wrote
it
in
up.
You wrote in the book. That's all right. You wrote in the book, this sounds good, Ban the
Yeah.
Box, but there's a problem. It doesn't work.
Yeah, yes,
Over
yes,
to you.
thank you.
Over to you.
So the problem here is, someone like me hears about this policy and says, okay, I understand why people think this could work, but if employers care about whether someone has a criminal record, and now you're just telling them they can't ask anymore, you haven't changed anything about their underlying incentives or why they cared about the criminal record. Now you're just removing that information. In most cases, I would expect most employers to now try to guess who has a criminal record instead of just treating everyone equally, right? They're still responding to the same incentives they had before. And so in the United States, we have huge racial disparities in who has a criminal record. If you are especially worried about a recent conviction, which most employers say they are, then you would be particularly worried perhaps, or you might statistically discriminate in economic terms against young Black men. And so this is an empirical question. Let's go look at the data. What happens to actual hiring? It turns out when you look at what happens in places that passed Ban the Box relative to places that didn't, trends in employment for these different groups, you see a 5% reduction in employment for young Black men with more limited education, which is the group that would have been helped by this policy if it worked, but is hurt because now what's happening is you have individuals who have a clean record who now are not getting their foot in the door because employers are guessing that they are likely to have a criminal record,
Which is
and
racist.
they can't ask, which is yes,
Racist.
it's racial discrimination, which is illegal, but very difficult to enforce.
Right. I mean, you can't prove it.
Can't prove it.
Unless they say, yeah, because you're Black,
Right.
you're likely a criminal, so therefore I'm
Yeah.
not going to hire you. But
And so this was a lot of the pushback from Ban the Box advocates when the research came out was, well, this just shows that racial discrimination is a problem, which I agree with, right? And so we just need to enforce our racial discrimination laws better, which I remember having these conversations at the time. I would love to write the paper about how we have changed enforcement in a way where we have eliminated racial discrimination in this country. That would be amazing. I am skeptical.
not going to happen.
I am skeptical. I think, this was in an administration, this was under the Obama administration. Presumably everyone was trying their best, at the time. And unless someone has an idea, I'm generally, my general stance on pretty much any policy area is if you've got an idea, let's go try it. If someone has an idea for how to improve enforcement of this particular law, let's go try it and let's test to see if it's working. So anyway, so Ban the Box policies, basically are heard unintentional, have this strong, important unintended consequence of reducing hiring for young Black men who don't have a criminal record. It also turns out subsequent research shows it's also not increasing employment for people with criminal records because employers can still check the background at the end of the process, and so they just don't hire them then.
Except that if the employer doesn't know that this Black male has a criminal history, and the person goes through the interview process and does it really well, and it's like, this is somebody I want to hire, and then they check it, right? Are they likely still then to not hire the person even though the person went through the whole?
That's what the research shows. So you could imagine, like, well, maybe there are just trade-offs here, right? And this is helping this group get their foot in the door and get more jobs, and then this other group is now worse off. And maybe there's some, depending on how you weight these two things, you might view that as a reasonable trade-off. And I think those of us who are writing the papers showing this increase in statistical discrimination against young Black men thought that there surely are some people who are benefiting from the policy. And subsequent research showed, using similar natural experiments in different states that implemented ban-the-box laws, that there was no increase in hiring for or employment for people with criminal records.
So are you saying the policy, since it doesn't work, just put the boxes back on the job applications, that you will be actually benefiting more people than hurting? Is that what?
That would be my policy recommendation, yeah. I think there are other things. I think this is a really important problem we need to solve. This policy is not working, and it actively makes it harder for a group that already struggles in the labor market for various reasons to find jobs. And there are other things we could be trying, and I'd rather be directing our energy toward those other things.
Do you recommend any other things in the book? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm really excited about, so my takeaway from this research, other research in other contexts is, we have this natural impulse to take information away when we wish people didn't care about something, and that almost always backfires. And so instead, if we think, okay, we want to change employers' decisions. Employers aren't hiring people with criminal records. We wish they did. Let's figure it out what exactly employers are worried about and directly address those concerns. So what might employers be worried about? They might be worried about differences in productivity. They might be worried about, maybe you're still actively engaged in crime, and so you could be arrested any day now, and so you're not going to show up to work, on time tomorrow morning. They will, in surveys, they'll tell you that they are worried about the risk associated with hiring someone with a record. What if this person commits another crime on the job? It turns out, how do we deal with risk in this country? Insurance. Employers in general buy insurance to cover potential liability for their employees. Most of those commercial insurance policies exclude people with criminal records. They don't cover any employee that has a criminal record. Well, that seems like an important gap, that maybe that's why employers now have this clear financial incentive to not hire people with records. There is a program called the Federal Bonding Program that's been run by the Department of Labor since the 1960s that no one has ever heard about. I think it covers something like 1,000 people a year across the whole country. It offers between $5,000 and $25,000 of coverage for people with criminal records. And they try to make it an easy lift for employers, but it's just so different from the way employers buy insurance policies in general that it actually is a huge bureaucratic hassle for employers to deal with this program. So something that my team is now working really hard on is figuring out, okay, what's the market failure here, right? Why are commercial insurers not offering this coverage? If employers clearly, and there is some neat evidence showing, this a neat field experiment showing employers actually do respond to insurance. So there's a field experiment on an employment platform with real world jobs where the researchers randomized different incentives to try to get employers to be willing to hire people with records. Then it would have real consequences for who they hired. And offering even $5,000 of crime and safety insurance increased employers' willingness to hire people with records by, I think, something like 16 percentage points. As much as another type of incentive that's common, wage subsidies, right? That insurance moved the needle as much as an 80% wage subsidy. So paying, if the platform offered to pay 80 cents of every dollar, and employers were willing to kind of increase their likelihood as much as with the insurance. Even with 100% wage subsidy, only half of employers are willing to hire people with records. Clearly there's something else going on here that employers are worried about. So the insurance really moved the needle, dollar for dollar, more than anything else. And so we've been thinking a lot about, okay, employers value this insurance. Why isn't the market offering this? One reason might be the insurers genuinely don't know how to price the risk. They've never covered this group before. And so that's really risky for them. Well, that's a place philanthropy could come in and offer to cover the losses for some period of time to collect the data and then, make the market happen. But this is a place where ultimately we all benefit if a employer gives a chance to someone with a record and hires that person. Presumably that's, going to make our communities safer, help them build a more stable life and avoid crime in the future. And so in economic terms, that means there are positive externalities to the community if an employer makes this hiring decision. That's a strong argument for a government subsidy for insurance in this case, or whatever else, might move the needle there. So that's something I'm really excited about. I'm passionate about insurance in this space.
Another question, have you considered going to law school and practicing law for a while? It would be interesting to see how immersing yourself in the practice of law might change or reinforce your views on the criminal legal system.
Oh. I very briefly, I'm not even sure it was more than an hour, considered going to law school after my PhD. There are people who do like a joint PhD, JD, and I really admire those people. That is a long haul. I have had enough school myself, but I work with a lot of lawyers, and I think our worldviews are very complementary. I think it is very helpful to have you just have different hypotheses about what could move the needle, how the world works, how people make decisions, what could change decisions. And again, I have my own ideas, but I really do think in this space where, again, the status quo is not working very well, we need to be trying new things to try to find something that works better. We need all the crazy ideas on the table. And so really bringing people with all their different perspectives in and saying, what do you think will work? What do you think will work? Let's go try all those things in different places and just see what the data tells us about what's effective. So I learn a lot from my lawyer colleagues.
Well, we have come to the end of our program, and we have time for just one final question, and that's going to be mine. And the question is this: what is next? Whose feathers are next up on your list to be ruffled?
Oh my gosh. I try to stay out of trouble on social media these days, but I don't know. I find I have been really gratified by doing the policy work, talking with state lawmakers. Again, most of our work's at the state level. I feel like we all feel like we're living in such a polarized world right now where good policy is just so hard. Everything's a cable news fight. And that's just not my experience talking to state lawmakers. I think state lawmakers have to balance their budget. They're closer to their constituents. They have to solve real problems. And they just genuinely are they typically don't have a staff. They're working part-time in most states. They have a day job they have to do too. They genuinely just need help. They need some fresh ideas and they need help figuring out how to go forward and work on them. And so I was expecting a lot more fights about, which evidence is good. And I expected more of the conversations that I would be having would be, fighting for the idea of evidence and different, why you trust this evidence versus this other evidence, and fighting people who would say, well, you can make data say anything, which, if it's good research, you can't. And those just aren't the conversations I'm having. The conversations on the ground are much more like, wait, we thought the only things on the table were solve poverty or lock everyone up forever. You're telling me there are other options, right? And it's yeah, there's a whole array of other options that we know work. And we have a whole bunch of other ideas that we would love for places to try. And we can help. And the goal is, the thing that we were hoping everyone will do is try them in a way we can learn from them, and we can help you do that. And most people I and my team are talking to are just thrilled to have that help. And so, I don't know.
State lawmakers, look out.
Right,
around the country.
Yeah.
So our thanks to Jennifer Doliak, author of The Science of Second Chances, and to the Ken and Jacqueline Broad Family Fund for supporting tonight's event. I am Ladaris Cordell. Thank you and take care.